I'm Nell, and this is Book Hunt. Today I want to talk about just like the theme of rebellion and revolution, political dissent, and how and why, I guess, authors depict these sort of transitional states and the forces that create them in society, and my thoughts surrounding that, I guess. The first book that comes to mind when I talk about rebellion and revolution is Once and Future Witches, which I really enjoyed, partly because I basically enjoy depictions of women rebelling against the patriarchy, especially when it's done in a way that is imaginative and exciting, but also sort of echoes elements of the suffrage movement, and the Once and Future Witches was just all of those things, plus witches, plus it sort of put into light something I'd been thinking about since reading Dabiri's non-fiction work, What White People Can Do Next, I think it's called, which is Once and Future Witches did a really good depiction of collaboration, of essentially a women's movement that excluded women of colour, not through any rule, but more because the community did not contain any women of colour where the movement was formed, and how that movement came to collaborate and join forces with a similar movement that was created in a community that was all women of colour, essentially. There wasn't that tension of which can sometimes happen in our society, where a white environment actually is unwelcoming of people of colour, and that's why it's excluded the people of colour, and so the collaboration has to resolve that tension. That was absent from this depiction, but I thought it was a really good representation of how dissenting groups can ally their efforts in order to achieve a common goal, even if not everything they want to achieve or not everything they are dissenting about is in common. And I think that at the root of all evil is a little bit capitalism at the moment, and a lot of what trans people need and what poor people need and what people of colour need and what women need, a lot of that intersects. That's why we talk about intersectional feminism, and there isn't any good reason not to work together on projects that further a specific practical concern. And I think that having a sort of a real world having a fantasy world depiction of that in action was really very exciting to me, because it felt a bit like, well, it felt partially like taking from history and creating a demonstration, but also felt like a reminder that we can do this. This is something that we can do. We can create coalitions of parallel causes that can be more effective together. So Once and Future Witches is my recommendation for if you want a witchy read that's all about rebellion. But really the core idea of that, the coalition, I was thinking about that because I read the Emma Dabiri work. And to be honest, it blew my mind a little bit. Emma Dabiri talked about things like parallel services, which I don't feel is as predominant now as it was once upon a time. When we think about activism now, we don't think about people creating community food banks because the government is failing to feed the poor. We don't think about creating a breakfast service for children before school so that they have somewhere to go when their parents go to work and they're definitely getting at least one meal that day. We don't think about those kind of community parallel services as activism anymore. And if you look at particularly organisations like the Black Panthers, those sort of community building parallel services, as in parallel to government services, provides an opportunity to opt out of what the government asks of you as a person without any power. And that creates power. It's just, it's something that I feel like is definitely missing in my community. and something that I would love to see grow and revive and maybe replace government entirely if I'm talking about proper fantasies. That brings me to the transition of power. How do we go from being unpowerful to being powerful? How do we take our society from being oppressive and flip that so that the people at the bottom of the pyramid are no longer holding up things that don't serve them? And I think that a really good depiction of how this begins, and I guess the outcome, is the duology by Akwaeke Emezi. Particularly bitter because it shows the beginnings of how you have to answer the question of to be violent or not to be violent in your process of transition, and how sanctioned passive acts of protest that have, you know, the form filled out and the tick from the police, how they are not actually acts of rebellion and defiance, and so not super effective. Or not effective at all, really. They let us do them so that we will shut up. It's supposed to quiet us. But what is the difference, and where is the path that doesn't involve violence? Because do we want power that is established in violence? Do we want power that is predicated on violence? I think that's a really interesting discussion in Bitter, particularly for a young adult novel. So complicated, so complex. Akwaeke Emezi is the bomb. But I like that you get the outcome in Pet as well. I like that you get to see what the society becomes. That is enjoyable. I don't think I can talk about violence and power without returning to talking about The Power, which I did a full review of recently. And I'll link that in the show notes. But The Power is what happens when you have a violent overturning of the power structure, and the authority of the people in charge is based only on their ability to physically dominate the people who are not part of their group, and the people who are part of their group, but to physically dominate. That's not actually the society that we want to create. So how do you create a shift in power structure without that violence? And I think that N.K. Jemesin's Broken Earth trilogy is like the best exploration of this that I've read recently, because in the world of N.K. Jemesin, the people with the power for violence are actually the subjugated. They are the people who society fears and therefore oppresses and enslaves and ostracizes. And the coming of the transition where they are able to take back their own power doesn't actually come from their violence. It does come from a big violent shift, and I don't know, maybe we're all waiting for climate change disaster in order to overthrow capitalism. I find these ideas very interesting because I'm anti-capitalist and I hate our current system. That's really the facts, isn't it? I think that the best way to overthrow capitalism is to stop investing in it and to withdraw our efforts from money making and put them into, I don't know, growing food or whatever. Do something that's actually concrete to your survival. I know that that's not actually really possible in a completionist way for most people, and if it is possible for you, then it's probably because you have a butt ton of money, which is a whole big contradiction thing. I just feel like if everyone started growing their own food and stopped going to the supermarket and stopped buying shit off Amazon, if everyone did it, then who would they tax? What would they do? I think that we have reached a point in our power structures where we have to acknowledge that our cooperation is required for them to continue. Why are we still cooperating? And I guess non-cooperation and depictions of non-cooperation was the whole point of this discussion. So these are a bunch of books that I think show interesting things about rebellion and revolution, and I would like to hear from you. What books have you read that say interesting things about power structures and how the power shifts from one group of people to another, and how we can force those shifts? I think that's a very interesting thing that gets shown a lot in literature. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this little brain dump of mine. I have enjoyed talking to you. This has been Book Hunt. If you would like to support my channel, please like and subscribe. Please comment. There's some links in the show notes of ways that you can support the channel beyond that if you'd like. But really, I just want you to talk to me. Okay, I love you. Bye-bye.